hot like the surface of the Phoenix. Silly nigga, I know, rabbits with mad tricks. Ill skill like I'm Kill Bill. Anybody could get body, getting God's like easy yoy grind. I break space while I'm keeping pace. Forget time set, places not settled yet. You not next, unless we talking hit list. Shit. Super smash and splits, there be no ifs and buts. Who knows why and when they happening? These niggas sour with the sweet bars, not having it. We not friends, don't worry about my split. I guess you handled it in a jiff. Hit strong like a whip for the piff. Shorty pulled up, felt neglected and she did. Stories of the somber lives I live. You would've thought I was content with despair. Shit. And lies ain't fair, fucking what you think is fair. Cause it's not paying fair to get in circle cause you boxed in square. Triangulate all your coordinates. Then acid rapid fire try be. Then you realize I'm the most ill you will ever be. Still, you was just a kid's meal with fragmented appeal like Dragon Balls, brain at the radar. Every time I rap, I go off like quasars. You just a petty scheme. We treating you like they do a felony. And I'm the biggest blackin', so you automatically my mini-me. Shush. These niggas bragging for they slay dragons. Who's gassing them? That's a pointless question. Pointing back at them. It's the God again, like I reincarnated. Build a country, get it mandated to have you publicly castrated. While you're shorty with me masturbating, y'all fucking with the little appropriators. We engage in big dangers. Catch me on the moon like a planet ranger. Red with ridiculous range. Tsukuyomi infinite. Combo insane. Straight lead, straight ahead into the elbow. Forgettable fellow, I'm still mellow. Keep your mouth closed. Green in my pipe like Luigi flows. We yelling out 94 the dog, yeah. And best believe all my dogs here. You looking stupid in the house like Corey. Same old story. Corey's getting treated like Morty's. We yelling out 94 the dog, yeah. You best believe all of my dogs here. You looking stupid in the house like Corey. Same old story. Corey's getting treated like Morty's. We yelling 94 the dog, yeah. Grip over fears. Infinitely immaculate every time for the East.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Glad to be back with you guys. For those that are gonna watch this live, or for those who are gonna be watching this later on at a different time, different place, different context. But yeah, it's good to be back with you guys for this this week's edition of our Pan-African film series. My name is Rashad, and today I'm here with my comrade, and we are members of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. The All African People's Revolutionary Party is a revolutionary mass political organization and political party that is dedicated to obtaining and achieving and realizing the objective of Pan-Africanism. And what we define as Pan-Africanism is the total unification and liberation of Africa under one scientific socialist government. And so that is our goal. We state that all the time. That's our goal. That's our objectives. That is what we are organizing for. That is what we are, geared to try and accomplish. And so, yeah. Also, we want to acknowledge the fact of whose land we're on. We'd like to do that, especially here in the Snakes, because we know that this is a settler colonial state, and that we exist on occupied and stolen land. And so, again, my name is Rashad, and I am out of so-called Denver, Colorado, or occupied Ute territory.
Yeah,
And
my,
yeah,
my,
yeah,
my name's Zach. I'm out of occupied Tuba territory, also known as Albuquerque, New Mexico.
yeah. And so yeah, we like to do that just to obviously to acknowledge, like I said, acknowledge whose land we're on and acknowledge the history that comes behind the settler colonial project that is called the United States of America. And so basically today, we're gonna be viewing this documentary called the Zionist Story. Um, I want to maybe like make a disclaimer that it is written by Israeli, or well, it is directed by an Israeli. Um, so I just wanted to throw that out there, that that's part of the whole context of this. I think people will enjoy it still, but either way, yeah. I just wanted to say that. Zach, do you have any other things before we start the film?
Just that the film is, like you said, by an Israeli, and it's a story of, it is the actual story of Palestine. So it does cover like the whole ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid. So even though it's biased in that, it's not like they're not like trying to whitewash the history, right? So that's it.
All right, so yeah, we'll get to it and stuff like that. It's not too long. It's about like an hour and 15 minutes. So we'll watch that, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss all the things that is talked about in the film. So yeah, we'll see you back here in a minute, and also yeah, in the chat as well. We'll be in the chat, and hopefully you guys are in the chat as well for those who are watching live. So yep, we'll get to it.
When did it all go wrong? Why did Arabs and Jews start hating each other? Is it because of Judaism? Is it because of Islam? Is it about oil? Money? Unlikely, as for over 1,300 years, since the very beginning of Islam, Jews and Muslims lived together in an unprecedented religious and cultural harmony in Palestine, North Africa, and Spain. It all seemed to be going just fine till the 20th century. But then something happened. And ever since, Jews and Arabs had been at each other's throats. The little picturesque town of Basel, in Switzerland, have possibly something to do with how it all went wrong. Basel was the setting for the first Zionist convention in 1897. Zionism was a national Jewish revival movement that sought to unite all Jews in a national homeland. They just weren't sure where that homeland was. Up until 1897, were all kinds of crazy ideas thrown into the air, like Uganda, Alaska, Madagascar, and other less exotic destinations. In Basel, however, the Zionist movement decided on an ideal and historically relevant location: Palestine. But what if the people who were already living in Palestine didn't want to have a national Jewish home set up in their country? The Zionists had some clear ideas about that problem from the very beginning. Theodor Herzl, considered to be the founder of Zionism, wrote in 1895, "We shall try to spirit away the penniless population across the border." Leo Motzkin, one of Zionism's most liberal thinkers, wrote, "The colonization of Palestine has to go in two directions. Jewish settlements in Eretz Israel and the resettlement of Arabs in areas outside the country." Chaim Weizmann, the head of the World Zionist Congress and future president of Israel, proclaimed the Palestinians to be the rocks of Judea, obstacles that need to be cleared on a difficult path. Amazing how little have changed in Judea since then.
The Jewish people came into this country, said this is our country, and they didn't say it's our country, but we recognize that there's another people living here. Let's see what we can work out. No, the whole idea of Israel until today is this is our country from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, and it's only our country. It's exclusively our country. There is no other people. There's a bunch of Arabs living here, that we know, but there's no people. There's no other people with a claim to the country, with a legitimate right to the country. This is our country exclusively, and therefore either you shut up if you're a Palestinian and you live in one of the little islands we'll give you by sufferance, not by right, or get out.
But back to the story. At the end of the 19th century, there were hardly any Jews living in Palestine. So the Zionists started campaigning all over the world for Jews to immigrate to Palestine. In Zionist vocabulary, this is called Aliyah, which means to ascend to a higher place. I'm not kidding. Most Jews thought the idea sounded like a pitch for a horror movie and decided to immigrate to the US instead. But some Jews bought the whole ascending thing and actually came to Palestine. The Zionists also launched Operation Buy a State. They went and bought all the land they could from Palestinian absentee landlords. Once the land was theirs, they threw out all the Palestinians that were living on it. The Zionists called this process Judifying the land and land redemption. Terms that, surprise, surprise, are still being used in current Israel regarding government policies. Then, in 1917, things changed. The British conquered Palestine from the Turks. They legalized the Jewish national home idea with the Balfour Declaration in the same year.
Palestine became a special case because the British violated the provisions of the Mandate for Palestine. because they put the Balfour Declaration into the Palestine Mandate, you say. What did this mean? It meant that for Palestine, the wishes of the inhabitants, 90% Arab, would not be listened to, and they would not be developed for independence. It would be Jews, once they came in through immigration, you see, they would be allowed to develop. And so it's really with the Palestinian Mandate and the violation of the mandatory provisions to give the Zionists the right to create a majority of Jews to create a Palestinian state, that the real Palestinian Zionist conflict begins, with very few illusions on both sides.
The Palestinians launched two popular uprisings against the Jews and the British blatant pro-Zionist policies. The first took place in 1929 and claimed hundreds of Palestinians and Jewish lives. The second, in 1936, was practically a small-scale war between the Palestinians and the British, who were also aided by the Zionists. It lasted for 3 years, and in the end, approximately 5,000 Palestinians died. The British also exiled the Palestinians' leadership and dismantled all Palestinians' paramilitary units. The Palestinians were left defenseless and leaderless.
Most of the Israeli commanders had studied the British reaction to the Palestinian revolt in 1936 and 1939, which became the manual book of what to do to the Palestinians in case of resistance. In fact, most of the atrocities you read about, and I'm sure most of you in this place know about it, most of the atrocities that you enlist as severe violations of human rights and civil rights in Palestine today, most of these violations were invented not by a Jewish Zionist mind, but by British mandatory authorities in the war against the Palestinians between 1936 to 1939. Examples: the idea that you demolish houses of people is a British invention. The idea that in order to make a search memorable to people, you destroy a house and then you move to the other house, and then to the other house, and then to the other house, was an invention by British officers on the ground. The idea that you shoot people without warning them, or you arrest them without trial, it's all from the reservoir of the mandatory anti-Arab, measures in 1936 to 1939. But of course the Israelis added their own brutal and callous ideas as the occupation continued.
Then, in the 1940s, the cards turned. Following a string of British pro-Palestinian policies, the Zionists launched terrorist attacks on British personnel and facilities.
Violence continues to rule in Palestine. British soldiers seek bodies in the Department of Labor building at Chechnik, where a few minutes before, a blast had partially wrecked the edifice. 3 policemen were blown to bits when they tried to remove an explosive-laden truck. Shaky walls are torn down. After a bomb explosion caused by terrorists on the British headquarters at Jerusalem, one entire corner of the King David Hotel, a building of 7 stories, was razed to the ground. The stone floors were cut.
88 innocent people died, and a good deal of the British High Command was wiped out. Their goal was to drive the British out of Palestine. The mastermind of the King David bombing was Menachem Begin. He would become Israel's Prime Minister. His accomplice, Yitzhak Shamir, would also later become Prime Minister. The pattern of terrorists, or, in other words, brutal military leaders transforming into top politicians, is very common in Israeli politics. At this point, the British have had enough, and they transferred the matter of Palestine to the UN.
The United Nations sent a committee to evaluate this in the summer of 47, and they recommended partition. And the Zionists eagerly accepted this, and the Palestinian Arabs didn't, because they were still 2/3 of the population, and they felt this was unjust. But nonetheless, this partition, which was approved in the UN after Thanksgiving in 1947, officially recognized 2 states.
In 1947, the Jews owned 5.8% of the land. In the UN partition plan, the Jews ended up with 56% of the land, almost 10 times of what they actually owned. The Palestinians had half of their land stolen right under their noses. Their population was split into 2, half of it living in the Zionist state as a minority. Even in the borders of the Jewish state, the Jews owned only 11% of the land.
The United States? Yes. Yugoslavia? Abstain.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
Why would the UN be so blatantly pro-Zionist? Do not underestimate the power of guilt. Anyone heard of the Holocaust? The UN sought to compensate the Jews over the deaths of 6 million Jews in World War II. Murdered by the Germans. And they decided that the Palestinians should pay for it. Makes perfect sense. However, this amount of land, more than half of Palestine, was still not enough for the Zionists. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Zionist movement in Palestine, wrote in 1937, "The Arabs will have to go. But one needs an opportune moment for making it happen, such as a war." The Palestinians had no desire to fight the Zionists or start a war. They were used to living under different sovereigns for hundreds of years: Egyptians, Turks, British, and now the Zionists. In 1948, Ben-Gurion tells the Jewish agency executives, "I believe that the majority of the Palestinian masses accept the partition as fait accompli, and do not believe it is possible to overcome or reject it. The decisive majority of them do not want to fight us." Towards the end of 1947, the Zionist leadership came together and drew Plan Dalet. Plan Dalet was about securing the borders of Israel by cleansing, expelling, and destroying Palestinian towns, villages, and urban neighborhoods. The plan was implemented by the Zionist armed forces.
And finally, in March, they began a push to ensure their control of areas that would become Israel under the partition. And as that happened, you began to get many more Palestinian Arabs fleeing, particularly after a massacre at a place called Deir Yassin, although people now think it was probably somewhat over 100, but not 200. But Begin and the Irgun and the Stern gang, Yitzhak Shamir was part of that. There was a combined attack on this Palestinian village that massacred many people. And the Palestinians did carry out a retaliatory raid, killing about 70 Jewish doctors on the road to Jerusalem shortly thereafter. But after that, you had mobile radio vans that Begin put into play, threatening more Deir Yassin's if the Arabs didn't flee. In other words, you'll be massacred just like Deir Yassin. So it became part of the propaganda.
Between the 30th of March and 15th of May, 1948, 200 villages were occupied and their inhabitants expelled. In some villages, such as Deir Yassin and Ain al-Zaytun, horrible massacres were perpetrated. The towns of Tiberias, Haifa, Tzfat, Beisan, Jaffa, and Accra fell into Zionist hands. As a result, more than 250,000 Palestinians were expelled. All of this took place before the 1948 war even started, before one regular Arab soldier set his foot on Palestinian soil.
I became a refugee when I was in a boarding school about 40 kilometers away from my home place. And in April 1948, the headmaster came to us and said, the Jews are attacking people around Tel Aviv, in Jaffa area. They will soon come to our area. I cannot protect you, so you better go home now, quite a bit early, maybe 6 weeks early, before the end of the scholastic year. And I was about 10 at the time, and the distance between the boarding school and my home is about 40 to 60 kilometers, depending on how you do it. And the road to my home was cut off frequently by Zionist soldiers who were riding in jeeps, and the jeeps, I remember clearly, had two machine guns, one pointing forward and the other one pointing backward. And so they would go at terrific speed in the area in which they have no physical presence, except they have garrisons of 30 soldiers in certain locations. They would terrify the farmers, and they would drive on the roads and in the fields, and they shoot anybody in sight. So I have a cousin who was older than me, about 20 years age at that time, and he said, let us walk back home. And he advised us that if you see these jeeps coming, you have to hide in the wheat field, which was then very much in evidence, until you hear the sound of the jeep going away. So we did that, and on the way I had to throw away my bag, my clothes and my books, and we had to walk about 40 kilometers, terrified as a child that one moment we see the jeep and they would kill us. When I arrived home, my mother was so sad, and I think I remember I had to sleep for about 2 days after this ordeal. Now, only 6 weeks later, precisely on the 14th, the night of 14th and 15th of May, our home was attacked again by about 24 tanks, which came to cut Gaza Strip. My home is close to Gaza Strip, but not in Gaza Strip, to cut it into two, to cut it, Gaza Strip into two. And they came, and we have my brothers and cousins, so on, they had some old guns. They held them from about 10 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock next morning. But finally, of course, they could not continue to resist, and the Zionists came and they blew up our homes and burned them. They also blew up the school, which my father built in 1920. It's a primary school, which was our pride because my father built that school at his expense in 1920 when he had no children. They also blew what's called bayara, which is a well, with motorized well, from which we drink, and also we water our gardens and plantations. Since that time, I spent many days and years, in fact, going through Europe's libraries, especially in London, but also in Paris and in Germany and Istanbul, trying to reconstruct the face of that invisible enemy to me, which destroyed my life ever since, until today. What did we do to them? I never saw a Jew in my life. I never saw, of course, a Zionist soldier in my life. And I had to construct even not only who they were, but the names of the officers who destroyed my life.
It is important to note that during that time, the British had almost 70,000 troops in Palestine. Their mandate, which lasted until the 15th of May, 1948, was to maintain law and order and to protect civilians. They failed miserably in that obligation. While the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians was going on, the Zionists were busy announcing to the world that a second Holocaust was imminent. The Jews were about to be overrun and thrown into the sea. At the same time, in February 1948, Ben-Gurion wrote to his foreign minister, "We will be able not only to defend, but also to take over Palestine as a whole. I am in no doubt of this. We can face all the Arab forces." Confident of their victory, the Zionists declared independence on the 14th of May, 1948. And Ben-Gurion became the first prime minister. On the 15th of May, 1948, 7 Arab countries declared war on Israel and invaded Palestine. In a joint public statement, they explained their reasons. The Zionist aggression in Palestine resulted in the exodus of more than 250,000 of its Arab inhabitants, and in their taking refuge in the neighboring Arab countries. In the beginning of the 1948 war, the Arab forces amounted to approximately 22,000 fighters. The Zionists had 40,000 soldiers. The Jordanians had an army that would have evened the odds. However, King Abdallah decided to sit this one out. Instead, he defended only the bits he wanted to attach to Jordan: Jerusalem and the West Bank.
And one of the myths of this whole period is that you had a little Israel, small Zionists against the Palestinians, and then later on in the war, when the Arab states invaded, that it was David versus Goliath. They were facing overwhelming odds. And this is simply not true, because even then Israel, from May of 48 on, had more troops than the Arab states, who had very small armies. See what I mean? So, but that's one of those things that many people believe. When you had the Arab state invasion, Egypt, Syria, you had Iraqi troops, you had some Saudi, the Lebanese did very little. And you had the Transjordanians. This will become Jordan, which includes the West Bank after 1948. Well, when they invaded, there was no coordination because no one trusted Abdullah of Transjordan because he had been dealing with the Zionists in sort of what we might call a non-aggression pact. Although many Israeli historians deny this vociferously, there clearly were discussions and agreements. And although maps show that when you have this attack, you have what we call a Transjordanian attack against Israel, in fact, there was really no attack per se. They were holding on to positions in the West Bank, but where you did have conflict was over Jerusalem. But the Israelis were able, the Zionists, well, they were Israelis after May 14th. When they were confronting the Egyptians, for example, or other people, they really didn't have to worry about their backs in terms of where the Jordanians were, because the Jordanians weren't going to attack them.
While the war was going on, the Zionists increased their ethnic cleansing operations. Villagers were expelled en masse, and massacres occurred in many places. The villages of Hula, Saliyah, and Bassa were but a few to suffer such atrocities during 1948. Once Zionist troops occupied a village that resisted them, they would round up all the men according to lists the intelligence officers would provide. On the whim of the local commander, they would either shoot them or march them away. The biggest expulsion and massacre happened in the city of Lid Ramle. 50,000 people were expelled from the city in a single day. 426 men, women, and children were killed by the Zionist forces. The general in charge of the occupation and expulsion of Lid Ramle was Yitzhak Rabin, who would later become Israel Prime Minister, serving 2 terms. In 1948, the Chicago Sunday Times reported on the Israeli tactics. Practically everything in their way died. Riddled corpses lay by the side of the roads. The New York Herald Tribune wrote, "The corpses of Arab men, women, and even children strewn about in the wake of the ruthlessly brilliant charge." The London Economist reported, "The Arab refugees were systematically stripped of all of their belongings. Then, they were sent on their trek to the frontier."
بدهم يطلعونا صاروا يطخوا. نحن آخر إشي طلعنا على الأرض قعدنا برا وشتاء بتشارين. تشارين شو شتاء عنا شتاء ما بدناش نطلع، ما بدنا نطلع. اجوا الجيش صفونا، انا بحكي عن بيت اهلي يعني، صفونا كلياتنا هيك وبدهم يرجعون. صرخت لهم امي، قالت لكم دخلكم، نحن بنطلع بنقعد بالشتاء برا وما تقتلوش.
فاتوا على البلد هاجموها اخر هجوم، لاقوا غير الختياريات ما كانوش كم وحده، لسه متخبيات بالبلد محل هيك تبان هذا بحطوا فيه تبن للبقر بخزنوا. لسه متخبي هو مع الختياريات، ولد عمره 16 سنة، ياسر علوطي اسمه، كانت دارهن هون عند حارة المنزول. هسه اطلعوا معهن مع النسوان، طلعوهن لما استهدوا عليهن، طلعوهن هن ماخذينه لغاد شوي طاخينه.
كيف كانت البلد لما رجعتي؟ متذكري كانت فاضي؟
شو وهري، شو فاضي؟ عم بقول لك اول ما رجعت فتنا الطريق من هون ماشيين ميلت على هذا البيت أشوف شو صار فيه. بعد القتلة في الأرض والكلاب عم تاكل فيه. كان طفل بين إيديهم ياكلوا فيه. فاتت وراي مرت خالي قالت له بدك اطلعي شو هتشوفي؟ بتقدريش يا كتيبة الغلبة قالت لي إلا تفوتي اطلعي. قعدت مدة أحلم فيه هذا الولد كيف كانت شكلته.
The Arab armies succeeded in occupying several remote Jewish settlements for a few days. They also successfully attacked army convoys. But the final victory, unsurprisingly, belonged to the Zionists. They conquered 80% of Palestine, destroyed 531 villages, 11 urban neighborhoods and towns. Approximately 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed and were forced to leave everything behind as they fled for their lives. However, the ethnic cleansing didn't stop in 1948. It just shifted gear. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, Israel conquered what was left of Palestine, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, the remaining 20% of Palestine and all the Palestinians were under Zionist control.
So it was really the whole spectrum of Zionist views from left to right were represented in the government that made the most important decision on the future of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip on the 19th of June 1967. And the decision was very clear. The decision was, there were actually three decisions taken at the time, and I don't think much, unfortunately, has changed. The first decision was that unlike 1948, the Israeli government cannot decide on the mass expulsion of the Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It was for me, looking at that document, a reaffirmation, if I needed one, that the Israeli political elite was aware of the ethnic cleansing it committed in 1948. So in 1967 they said very loud and clear, we cannot do what we did in 1948. They say it very clearly in their documents. So they can't expel. Not that it prevented them from expelling hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from the West Bank in particular, but also from the Gaza Strip. But this was not similar to the ethnic cleansing of 1948 because it was not a systematic mass expulsion of the people from the country. It was expulsion of locations according to different strategic considerations of the Israeli army that wanted to downsize the number of Palestinians under Israeli control. So the first decision was not to continue the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in the same way that it was committed in 1948. The second decision was that unlike the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, which the Israelis occupied in 1967 as well, unlike those two territories, which the Israeli government at the time recognized as belonging respectively to Egypt and Syria, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were part of Israel forever. To keep the territories as part of Israel without expelling the people. And that, of course, led to the third decision. If you keep the territories and you don't expel the people, what do you do with the people? Do you turn them into Israeli citizens? Do you annex officially the territories to Israel? And the third decision was to create what, and this is my words, not their words, but to create a mega prison. To create an amazing human invention that only the Zionist ideology could produce. The idea that you can lock at the time 1.5 million, now double the number of 1.5 million, that you can lock them in a regime that is similar to the concept of a prison, with all kinds of variations on the prison concept. It can be an open prison if the inmates behave themselves. They can even go and work outside, provided they come back to be in the prison at the end of the day. They can have autonomy in the prison. They can run their life as they wish, provided they accept the concept. Should they resist, the Israeli government would move quickly into a high security prison with all the punitive measures that harsh wardens would take against inmates in such a situation.
Under the army's protection, and with the government's aid, Israeli settlements were erected in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Today, they cut through the Palestinian land and keep spreading. Some of them, like Ariel and Ma'ale Adumim, are already considered to be cities. The purpose of these Jewish enclaves is to isolate and stifle Palestinian settlements. This is achieved also through roads for Jews only, military checkpoints, and land seizure.
But we want a Palestinian state, the Bantustan, because we have to relieve ourselves of the Palestinian population, but it can't be a viable state. You see? And that's where the Bantustan idea comes in. So there are 4 elements on the ground that have created that Bantustan. And if you look at a map, we even have maps that show almost exactly the borders of this emerging Bantustan. 1 are areas A and B. The areas that were reserved for Palestinians during Oslo, the Oslo peace process. And that locks the Palestinians into these islands already on about 42% of the West Bank. Then, in addition to creating the contours of the state by areas A and B, Israel has created massive settlement blocks. 7 settlement blocks, not just discrete individual settlements, but 7 blocks that are consolidated, that then divide those areas A and B into islands, create Israeli corridors in between, and those settlement blocks will then be annexed to Israel. So Israel will essentially occupy 90% of the country, and the Palestinians will get 10% of the country in little tiny islands. That's the idea. That's the second element. The third element is the infrastructure. In other words, that Israel is building, with almost total American support, a $3 billion system of bypass roads and highways throughout the occupied territories that then link them physically into Israel proper. So that you create in the country, it's already been done pretty much, one urban fabric where the settlement blocks are an integral part of the metropolitan areas of Israel itself. One highway grid in which the bypass roads and highways of the West Bank and Gaza are integrated into those of Israel. One electrical system, one water system. So you create a situation on the ground where it's impossible to detach meaningful territory from Israel for a Palestinian state. That's the third element. And the fourth element is the wall that's being built. The wall that's being built that Israel calls a fence, because in some parts it's a massive fence, but when it comes to Palestinian populated areas, it becomes a wall. It's a wall twice as high as the Berlin Wall. A 24-foot high concrete wall that physically creates actual prison conditions for entire Palestinian cities, like Tulkarm and Qalqilia, cities of 70,000, 80,000 people, that alienates hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their land, from their water. It has tremendous impact. But what this wall does, the separation wall, is that it then sets these contours, these borders that have been set by the settlement blocks in areas A and B in concrete, so that it's a $2 billion system linked to a $3 billion highway system, linked to I don't know how many billions of dollars in the settlements, all designed to close the Palestinians into these little tiny islands.
The Palestinians rose up against the Israeli oppression in two popular uprisings, or Intifadas. The first started in 1987 and ended in 1993. The Palestinians stood up to the Israeli oppression, extrajudicial killings, mass detentions, house demolitions, deportations, and land seizure. But they were no match for the well-equipped Israeli army. Over 1,100 Palestinians died during the uprising, and many more were imprisoned or expelled. The first Intifada was put down by the Israeli government with so much brutality that the UN condemned Israel for violating the Geneva Conventions. The Intifada succeeded, however, in bringing the Palestinian case to the attention of the world. It also heralded the schizophrenic path that the Palestinian resistance would take from now on. While peaceful, non-violent demonstrations were conducted, suicide bombers entered Israel and blew up buses packed with people. The Second Intifada began in 2000 and continues until today. So far, it has claimed the lives of over 5,300 Palestinians and over 1,000 Israelis. While it was raging, the only true democratic elections in the whole Arab world took place in the West Bank and Gaza.
الحكومة الفلسطينية العاشرة برئاسة رئيس الوزراء الفلسطيني المكلف الأخ إسماعيل هنية قد منحت الثقة بالأغلبية المطلقة لأعضاء المجلس التشريعي.
Frustrated with their corrupt, stagnant government, Palestinians voted for the radical fundamentalist Muslim party of Hamas. Hamas' electoral victory was used by Israel to instigate a worldwide economic embargo against the Palestinians. Also at that time, 10,000 Jewish settlers were evacuated from the Gaza Strip. After the evacuation, the strip was hermetically sealed and turned into the largest prison on the planet. Israel controls all sea, land, and air access to Gaza. It regularly cuts off all food, water, and power supply to the strip in order to punish the population for their defiance. In response to bombing by F-16 jets and Apache helicopter gunships targeted assassinations, Palestinians fire homemade rockets at Israeli settlements.
The political and military elite of Israel, since 1967 until 2008, has stuck to the same strategic decision about the occupied territories. That this area cannot be annexed to Israel as long as it has a large Palestinian population in it. This hasn't changed. This is still what Israel is all about when it comes to these two parts of Palestine, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Secondly, that the Palestinians can at best have an open prison concept that would even be called a state, that's okay, as long as they accept a total Israeli control of their life through a bureaucracy that runs every aspect of their being and existence, where the main coin or the main trading card is collaboration with the bureaucracy in return for opening a kiosk, a business, going to university, being appointed as a teacher, going abroad, moving from one village to the other. This is the main formula. But it was decided upon in 1967. Not contrary to what we hear today, that these are all Israeli measures that are countering Palestinian terrorist attacks or violence. It's quite amazing how the history documents show that all these supposedly retaliatory Israeli actions were Israeli decisions against which the Palestinians retaliated, not the other way around, including the wall. The wall was already decided upon in 1967. It was not. The wall was not built as a reaction to the suicide bombs. The wall was a natural consequence of the mega prison. Once it was clear that the Palestinians, by and large, are not happy with the mega prison. Or they took them 20 years to show it. Doesn't matter. But it was very clear. So, in this respect, this is the second thing, is that the Israeli policy is about maintaining, perfecting the mega prison. And the inevitable happened. It really looks like a prison. It didn't look like a prison in 1967. It looks like a prison. The bureaucracy became really prison wardens. They were not to begin with. And finally, and with this I would end, the greatest, maybe, Israeli success, which I hope this meeting and others would prove that this is a failure, but it is not yet a failure. The greatest success is that 41 years onwards, these Israeli policies are not known. Definitely the fact that they were taken in 1967 and hasn't changed is not known. And that the Israeli, very simplistic to mind, not very sophisticated, very transparent lies about what they are doing, that any intelligent person could easily decipher and expose for what they are still being repeated by the mainstream media in the West, including The Guardian, by all the mainstream television networks, including the BBC and ITV and Sky News and what have you, and is accepted by all the political elites of the West, including, of course, the British government.
Today, Israel continues to steal Palestinian land in order to build more and more settlements. The security wall that Israel erected is instrumental in this, as it encloses a large portion of the West Bank's most fertile land. $3.5 million Palestinians live as virtual prisoners. In the eyes of the Israeli state, they have no basic human rights. Israel kidnaps and imprisons Palestinians on a daily basis. There are over 10,000 Palestinians in Israeli prisons. Men, women, and children are killed almost daily for opposing the occupation. The Israeli state, with its Zionist ideology, won't stop until the last Palestinian living in Palestine is expelled, imprisoned, controlled, or killed. The Palestinians who live in Israel are treated as second-class citizens. They are excluded from the society and are subjugated by racist policies.
Now we're starting to see the settlement. This is the beginning of the settlement to be. They gave it in the name of Kidmat Zion, which is a very religious name. And it is to absorb around 250 housing units, which means nothing less than 15,000 new settlers. The settlers who moved here are members of the fanatic ideological settlement movement called Gush Imunim. So those are the new neighbors that we have, the fanatic ideological settlers. And you can see that they have not just the army to protect them and to enslave them, but also they have special guarding agents that are sitting on top of their house. So we see that sometimes when the women are getting down to throw the garbage, she has a bodyguard in front and a bodyguard behind. When the women and their children are moving out of the neighborhood, there is a bodyguard car in front and a bodyguard out behind. And those bodyguards, by the way, are not paid by the government. They are paid by my taxes as a taxpayer, because these are private security companies that are paid by my taxes for special requests based on security needs. And of course the security needs are not to protect me as a taxpayer, but to protect the illegal settlers that are moving on my land against my will. And that's the controversial reality that we here live in. Because these are not only the lands that were confiscated. Behind the mountain you have a vast majority of lands that are owned by Abu Dis overnight were announced as confiscated areas for security reasons, and they won't allow me to move around because at one point I'm sure the security will follow me. But I wish I could take you, like you see the wall zigzagging in and out. Palestinians out, Israelis and empty land in order to grab all that empty lands for the expansion of a settlement to be. Now, the bigger picture of Jerusalem that the Israeli municipality is not even hiding is the issue of metropolitan Jerusalem, the master plan 2020 for the metropolitan of Jerusalem, where if you follow the route of the wall, it is bringing Palestinian neighborhoods out and bringing illegal Israeli settlements in to the metropolitan of Jerusalem. For example, Abu Dis, you see how Abu Dis is adjacent to Jerusalem. It's like within walking distance, 5 minutes walking distance, you're in Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem. Internationally, historically, this is Jerusalem. But Abu Dis, with its population, concentrated Palestinian population, is out of the master plan for Jerusalem, whereas Ma'ale Adumim settlement that is built on Abu Dis land, like 5 kilometers from here, is into the master plan of Jerusalem because of their Jewish majority or their Jewish existence. The same thing for Bethlehem area. Bethlehem, the city of Jesus, is out of Jerusalem, metropolitan, although it's 12 kilometers drive. It's like 12 minutes drive literally between center Jerusalem and center Bethlehem. But because it's concentrated Palestinian area, it is out of the metropolitan of Jerusalem. But Gush Etzion blocks, settlement blocks that are 20 kilometers away from Jerusalem are within the metropolitan of Jerusalem, out of the master plan for Jerusalem, whereas Ma'ale Adumim settlement that is built on Abu Dis land, like 5 kilometers from here, is into the master plan of Jerusalem because of their Jewish majority or their Jewish existence. The same thing for Bethlehem area. Bethlehem, the city of Jesus, is out of Jerusalem, metropolitan, although it's 12 kilometers drive. It's like 12 minutes drive literally between center Jerusalem and center Bethlehem. But because it's concentrated Palestinian area, it is out of the metropolitan of Jerusalem. But Gush Etzion blocks, settlement blocks that are 20 kilometers away from Jerusalem are within the metropolitan of Jerusalem because of their Jewish population. So the metropolitan of Jerusalem is so clear racist, apartheid, whatever you want to call it. Jews in, Palestinians out. So this is the bigger picture, and the internal picture is with the Israeli Jewish fanatics that we have to deal in. So you have fanatics on the ground, you have fanatics at decision-making level. You tell me what is the way out.
Generally, the Palestinian opposition takes the form of peaceful, non-violent protests. Like in the village of Bilin, and Nialin. But from time to time, it also takes the form of suicide attacks, when desperate young men, feeling they have nothing to live for, explode themselves in Israeli cities. There is no opposition to Zionism.
So the Metropolitan of Jerusalem is so clear. Racist, apartheid, whatever you want to call it. Jews in, Palestinians out. So this is the bigger picture, and the internal picture is with the Israeli Jewish fanatics that we have to deal in. So you have fanatics on the ground, you have fanatics at decision-making level. You tell me what is the way out.
Generally, the Palestinian opposition takes the form of peaceful, non-violent protests, like in the village of Bilin and Nialin. But from time to time, it also takes the form of suicide attacks, when desperate young men, feeling they have nothing to live for, explode themselves in Israeli cities. There is no opposition to Zionism in Israel. There are only small, insignificant groups that remain almost invisible and ignored in Israeli society. And their focus is almost exclusively on the West Bank occupation and the Gaza siege. None of the existing peace organizations in Israel is concerned or even interested in the real causes of the conflict. One of the biggest opposition groups comprises of some 50 anarchists, most of them still in high school. They joined peaceful Palestinian demonstrations in West Bank villages, and end up playing cat and mouse with the soldiers pursuing them through the hills. Another group, Gush Shalom, is mainly made up of senior citizens
You're welcome. Nice. Thank you. Welcome.
Just like Combatants for Peace and a few other tiny groups. Gush Shalom is not against Zionist policies as a whole. It only specifically protests against the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza siege. In this situation, it is hard to even determine how positive the impact of those leftist organizations is. After all, their very existence convinces most Israelis and the world that Israel is an open, free, democratic state. The real, desperately needed discussion about the ultimate fate of the remaining Palestinians simply does not exist. All the parties in the Israeli parliament, from right to left, are Zionist. In Israeli society, and increasingly in the outside world, it is only permissible to question the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza siege. Anyone who questions the occupation of Palestine and the catastrophe Zionism brought on Palestinians is ostracized, silenced, called an anti-Semite, or, in case of a Jew, a self-hating Jew.
I don't think that we can implement a full right of return for however many Palestinians do want to return and still maintain the integrity of the State of Israel as a democratic Jewish state, as we in Israel would like to have it. So I think we're going to have to look for a compromise on the right of return, a compromise that will both acknowledge the suffering and give some forms of reparation and help Palestinian refugees integrate into whatever countries they are in today and accept some back into Israel. But will also have implementation on a level that Israel can live with and still maintain itself as Israel and not as the state of the Palestinian refugees.
I am not afraid. When I will be called to war, if the Palestinians try to attack my country, I will defend my country. Like I defend my country against the Egyptians, against the Syrians, against the Hezbollah, against everyone else. I don't think that should be our consideration when we go to think whether or not to pull back from the territories, because as I have already explained, every minute of our being in the territories is harmful to Israel, is exposing Israel for more terrorist attacks, and the Israeli Defense Force is not built to fight terrorist attacks. It is built to fight countries.
Activist groups everywhere, of all faiths and none, who campaign for justice and peace, need to ask themselves some uncomfortable questions about how effective really they have been, and more to the point, what they must do to be more effective. In my view, there are two political realities to be faced. The first is that Zionism is not interested, and has never been interested, in peace on any terms the overwhelming majority of Palestinians and most Muslims could accept. The second is that the governments of the major Western powers are never ever going to use the leverage they have to call and hold the Zionist state to account for its crimes unless they are pushed to do so by informed public opinion, by manifestations of democracy in action. Now, as I said on this very platform in November 2006, and I think it bears repeating, the problem throughout the mainly Gentile Judeo-Christian world is that the citizens of nations, generally speaking, are too uninformed to do the pushing. In fact, they are not only underinformed, they are misinformed, conditioned, one could even say brainwashed, to accept a version of history, as Moshe mentioned, which is simply not true. And this has happened in large part because the mainstream media, like almost all politicians, is terrified of offending Zionism. Now it follows that if governments are to be pushed to do what is necessary to bring the conflict in and over Palestine to an end, if, in other words, the citizens of nations are to be empowered to take part in informed and honest debate, to make democracy work for justice and peace, it follows, I believe, that there is an absolute first requirement, and that is the liberation of the citizens of the Western nations. Liberation from the tyranny of Zionism's propaganda lies, upon which the first draft of Judeo-Christian history is constructed. The good news is that the tools to make this liberation possible are now available. They are books which expose Zionism's version of history for the propaganda nonsense it is. The core essence of this nonsense is that there was no ethnic cleansing of Palestine, that poor little Israel has lived in danger of annihilation, driving into the sea of its Jews, and that Israel had no partners, Palestinian or Arab, for peace. Israel's existence has never ever been in danger from any combination of Arab military force, and that Zionism's assertion to the contrary was the cover which allowed Israel to get away where it mattered most with presenting its aggression of self-defense, and itself was the victim when actually it was and is the oppressor.
In terms of racism, there is no difference between apartheid South Africa and Zionist Israel. The Zionists, however, have the biggest weapon that was not available to South Africa apartheid. Bigger than F-16s, tanks, and nuclear missiles put together. It's called the Holocaust. The Holocaust allows Zionists to manipulate world public opinion and to stifle any possible open discussion. It is simply their biggest asset. Today, to be an anti-Zionist is construed as being anti-Semitic, and to be anti-Semitic can send you to prison in Europe.
All this is happening before our eyes, and yet Israel gets away with it. How could that be? South Africa didn't get away with it. You know, everybody's criticizing China for its oppression. How does Israel get away with it? And that's one of the real problems that we have. One reason is, of course, is because of the media that tries to be even-handed or pro-Israeli. Zionism has a credibility, the idea that Israel's a Jewish state has a credibility that apartheid never had in South Africa. Christians that are critical hesitate to speak out because they're afraid of being smeared as anti-Semites. So you find very little criticism of Israel in the media. Part of it is, of course, the fact that we're dealing with Jews. All this is happening before our eyes, and yet Israel gets away with it. How could that be? South Africa didn't get away with it. You know, everybody's criticizing China for its oppression. How does Israel get away with it? And that's one of the real problems that we have. One reason is, of course, is because of the media that tries to be even-handed or pro-Israeli. Zionism has a credibility, the idea that Israel's a Jewish state has a credibility that apartheid never had in South Africa. Christians that are critical hesitate to speak out because they're afraid of being smeared as anti-Semites. So you find very little criticism of Israel in the media. Part of it is, of course, the fact that we're dealing with Jews. So the non-Jewish world feels guilty for the Holocaust, feels guilty about the Jewish issue, and so on.
It's used politically in a very effective way, in a very cynical way. I mean, it's very hard to say this, but I think it's true. It's seen as a very useful PR tool. You know, the way the government plays on the guilt in Europe over the Holocaust, so that you can't criticize us. Look what you did to us, you see. It intimidates non-Jews. It closes up discussion. It's very effective. And Israel is willing, for the sake of its PR and to silence critics, it's willing to sell the victims of the Holocaust. Israel is willing, for the sake of its PR and to silence critics, it's willing to sell the victims of the Holocaust. It's willing to sell the victims of the Holocaust.
The sad fact is that those 6 million Jews that died because of a fascist, racist ideology are cynically being used today to justify and support another fascist, racist ideology. As most of my family, on both sides, were amongst the victims of the Holocaust, I withdraw my permission from Israeli government and Zionists worldwide to use their death in such a hideous way. Interested to know what you can do about it? Insist that your government challenges Israel and its racist, fascist ideology of Zionism. I made this documentary so none can say in the future, "We didn't know." Now you know, so you can act. I also made
All right, so yeah, welcome back, everybody. Sorry for the technical issues. You know how shit like that goes. All right, so yeah, welcome back, everybody. Sorry for That's what happens.
Yeah, I want to give criticism to Comcast and give self-criticism for not having downloaded the film beforehand. Yeah, sorry, folks.
Yeah, but you know how that stuff goes. But thanks for sticking with us, sticking through it with us, and stuff like that. So yeah, now we can discuss the Zionist story, which like gave a pretty detailed history from the start of the Zionist, the racist ideology that is Zionism. From Theodore Herzl to the present, basically, to when this was made, which I think was in 2006, maybe, but I could be wrong on that. But yeah, we can get into this discussion. Were there any initial thoughts you had, Zach, about the documentary?
Well, at the end, especially, I thought it was interesting how they were saying that they used the explanation of the Holocaust, right, to say that this is kind of justification for why there's been no lack of like serious international pressure. But one thing that came to my mind was where the international communist movement was, because if you know the history of South Africa, it had lots of international support from various communist movements. But one thing that I also know is, like, throughout this film, throughout the history it lays out, is that post World War II, there's lots of anti-communism. There's the Cold War. There's construction of NATO. So I think perhaps that has more explanatory power for why there's such a lack of coordination of international, like literally support for international like armed struggle, because that's the real criticism you got to give, the criticism of armed struggle, not this reading books, and yeah, we have all the knowledge, but the international support is kind of like key in these kind of big struggles. You're dealing with what they said, an open air prison. So I don't know enough of like history around the international struggles for Palestine, but I would really like to do more research, especially around anti-communism and what that and what impact that had, because that to me seems like a very interesting line of thinking.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think, obviously throughout the whole time, Black left organizations have definitely been, or African left communists and, left organizations have definitely been, like very upfront, and honestly, like, some of the first people and organizations to, show that support for Palestine outside of, outside of their comrades and, in Lebanon and stuff like that out there. But, for leftist organizations and stuff like that, like the Black Panther Party, which always was had a pro-Palestine line. They did work with the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, our organization, of course, as well.
I wonder about SNCC.
SNCC was SNCC was the, I'm pretty sure, if not, SNCC was the like one of the first ones, especially within the snakes within the U.S. And that got Kwame Ture and it might have been H. Rap Brown at the time, like kicked out of SNCC and stuff like that for having that pro-Palestine line because of what is that Jewish organization? The Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. They had, they were giving they were giving aid to SNCC and stuff like that. So they had a little conflict on that when Kwame Ture and then they came out with that with the pro-Palestine line and the anti-Zionism, and he got labeled anti-Semite. And he's been like, that was back when he's in his 20s, and they got that label stuck with him the rest of his life.
Hey, that's a perfect lesson. Don't let white nonprofits fund your movement.
Exactly. And then you end up kicking out, some of the greatest revolutionaries that, the world has seen, but especially this country specifically. So, yeah. But also, South Africa has always had, obviously, because of the similarities between the struggles, obviously, because we know Israel is a settler colonial state. We know that apartheid South Africa was a settler colonial So when it was South Africa, or what was it called before? What's the name? That's our name, Rhodesia. Rhodesia. When it was Rhodesia in South Africa, that's when it's a settler colonial state. So they always had solidarity. We always had solidarity with each other's movement. So yeah.
Right. And I think it's important too to back up a bit, because this film also conflates Judaism and Israeli national identity and Zionism. Is like when we're watching this film, it should be clear that we're not anti-Judaism, right? It's specifically the ideology of Zionism, what Zionism is, what that project is, which is settler colonialism. It's ethnic cleansing. It's this fascist ideology. So it's not. A lot of people like even the film did talk about the conflating Judaism with what Israel represents, but it should be clearly delineated or demarcated that Zionism is not Judaism. Zionism uses Judaism as a very powerful ideological weapon, but it's backwards. It's reactionary. It's used for genocidal purposes, right?
Exactly, most definitely. And so we can't, like you said, we can't ever let these people be defining our terms for us and stuff like that, and acting like they can dictate to us what the truth is and stuff like that. We know the truth. We know what Zionism is. We know that it's out of the side of the context of Israel using it as like you said, as an ideological weapon, as a tool for the ethnic cleansing, for the genocide, for the the murders and the land theft. Outside of that, they don't have anything really in common. They're two separate things. And so and like the film stated, they go back to Theodore Herzl's words, him saying it we're gonna move in, and those people that are there, they're gonna have to get out. And so and then they go into one of Israel's first presidents, who was saying that the Palestinian people are like the rock of Judea, but they're not how you would think of a rock, but they're they're a boulder, they're something that's gonna impede the path of that Zionist project, and they have to be removed. So these are words from the founders, the ideological where the ideological groundwork for Zionism comes from, and these are their words, not ours. They're telling you what it's meant for and stuff like that. And this is before the Holocaust. So
this is like in 1897. This is the Zionist the first Zionist Congress that was chaired, that was convened by Herschel. So he's he lays out this groundwork, and what is it? Settler colonialism, but it gives it a name and conflates it with Judaism.
Yeah, and like the film said, that's I don't know if any. I know America tried to use it in their expansion west after they had already conquered, the western, the eastern, and the Midwest of the snakes. But they use that manifest destiny to justify moving westward even further into California and stuff like that, because that's that was their, they had to do that. They were ordained by God to do that. And I don't know how many of us have seen them textbooks with the stupid fucking white angel bitch.
Yeah.
That's fucking flying across the page and stuff like that.
She's bringing the telephone poles along with her and all this progress against the so-called savage. Yeah, I've seen that image. That's yeah, it's terrible.
Exactly. And so, they use manifest destiny and stuff like that. But I don't know if you can really get something like much stronger of a hold than like returning to your home, to your traditional homeland that you never occupied because of the religion. So like I think it's the Ruba bin Wahab who says like, well, now God is involved in land disputes and stuff like that. He's involved in real estate and everything like that. And it's just, but you can't get I don't know if you could get like a tighter like origin story than saying that's ordained by the Bible. It's right there. We're the Jewish people. That's our homeland, even though they weren't there.
I mean, you can see some of this kind of like usage of religion towards exploitation and the kind of I don't know what you call it, but the kind of religious teaching where some pastors tell you, that God wants you to profit. God wants you to start open like a business. I've heard that kind of stuff where he's like, and to me, it's, obviously Zionism is like, way out there and it's its own thing, but it kind of reminds me of that kind of similar thinking.
Yeah, most definitely. Cause it's just, it's such a powerful tool to say that something is ordained by God, because that's divine right. Now we're taking it back to, like feudalistic times and how the kings and the queens, they were ordained by God to be in this position. How can you question them if they're ordained by God? How can you question this path if it's laid out in the holiest text in the history of humankind? So like it's real convenient to me to say, to use religion in that form and fashion and stuff like that, to abuse it to that level. It's lasted, so I guess it is effective, but it's pretty fucking sick.
And the whole Zionist, like when I was watching this documentary, one thing I kept bringing up in my mind is that if this settler project is such a brutal regime and the process is so brutal and it involves ethnic cleansing, what does that make of the history of the U.S.? I mean, they went through the same projects with indigenous people from the U.S. and other places as well throughout the Western Hemisphere. It's not just the U.S. I mean, this is like the history of Latin America, of South America, whatever you want to call it. This is these are the Zionist project is unique in its like modernity, but it's not unique in like in history. I feel like, and I could be wrong, but that's how I kind of see it. And it's like, if calling yourself a Zionist is so offensive, I wish people would see how offensive it is to call yourself an American. That's like how it's equivalent in my mind.
No, most definitely, because like that's some of these things are like we're in opposition. We've seen in the film that at one point in time Britain was in opposition to some of the Zionists that had already settled and occupied Palestine, but at the same time, all these settler colonial projects are derived from each other. They're always taken from each other. We know that that the Nazis, that Hitler, he wrote in Mein Kampf that he wanted to replicate what America had done to the indigenous people here, and he just wanted to do it going east instead of west, and he called it his the American model. So like, but we know that Britain was doing the same exact things. We know that France was doing the same exact things. So like, it's just, all these things are connected. And they're always like taking and stealing things from each other. I'm like, oh shit, we can use that. Like I said in the film, some of the same tactics that are used today in Palestine by the IDF and by the Israeli state were developed by the British who were there, who had occupied the land in the early 1900s. And so, you know what I mean? Like they're always taking and stealing stuff from each other that they can use wherever around the globe, and then pretend like they have nothing to do with each other. Like, because it gets us confused and we think that all these things happen in isolation when they're all like positive and negative forces going back and forth with each other, that are all interconnected. So yeah, it's interesting how they do that shit.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like in our modern economy right now, it's a global economy because there's lots of trade deals, lots of trade agreements, there's trade organizations, and there's also international organizations. So as much as it's all formalized through like IMF, like NATO, World Bank, and all that, there's still lots of that going on even before it's formalized. So the reason I bring that up is because it helps to think of things not in isolation, like you were saying. Like, you know, there's early in the film they even stated that the method of Israeli terrorism started off with the British, literally taking, they said, if I remember right, they said destroy one house and then go and do like knockdowns in other homes so that they remember that that there was a home destroyed. Like it was very like ideologically influenced the tactics of like terrorism, which I thought was interesting. So
yeah, and like, and you know, then it's always the, like, you know, the who gets labeled the terrorist and who gets labeled, you know, just like our righteous freedom fighters. You know, for us, our freedom fighters are the ones who are actually fighting against, you know, systemic oppression, who are actually fighting against capitalism and settler colonialism, and we're trying to develop our self-determination and being self-sufficient and equitable distribution of wealth. Those of who are fighting for the masses, like, we don't have a project that's dedicated to that is dedicated to the smallest amount of people possible. But we get labeled terrorists for fighting for our own, for our own freedom, for our own self-determination. But these people who are fighting to uphold something like a racist ideology like Zionism, or, to uphold capitalism and imperialism, or at the very least to be, bedfellows with them and, to aid them in places that they can and in places that they can, they get labeled the freedom fighters. So it's just interesting how they get to do that. And we see that they've been doing it for a long time. That's their thing, to label some people as savages or terrorists. Oh, they're just fucking crazy. The way they do things are crazy. But the truth and the overwhelming, like, it's just right there in our face. We see what they're doing to us all around. We see what the imperialists are doing. We see what the Zionists are doing to the Palestinians. They murdered 42 Palestinians since the beginning of the year. 9 children. I'm pretty sure. I think it's 9 children that they've killed just in a month and 2 weeks. So 6 weeks. It's just, so we know who the real terrorists are. But they will always try and confuse us.
Yeah, and to your point about the children, one thing that's important to note, especially in our modern context, is that Palestinian populations are largely like young. It's young people, because they don't get a chance to like age because they're killed all the time, literally. So that brings up another good point. I'll ask you this as just a question: is at the end of the film, the director was interviewing a couple people, and one of the women was basically saying that the solution to the Palestine-Israeli conflict would have to be some kind of compromise, maybe even some integration. What do you think about that, Rashad? What do you think? Is there a situation in which Palestinian and Israelis live peacefully together? Two-state solution? What's going on here?
That's I'll start off by saying what the comrade Nwadi, aka Obi, said in the chat, and he said the compromise is one united Palestine. That's fucking it. And that's, you know, that's basically where it begins and ends, because there is no compromise to occupation. There is no compromise, and that's, you hear this a lot from people who from Israeli supporters, from Zionist supporters, and they'll say stuff like, "Oh, you know, Palestine has rejected multiple peace offers." Peace offers can't come from the barrel of a gun. Like that's not how it works. It can't come from terrorism, and also peace can't come attached to the occupation. So if we agree that there's an occupation, then the Palestinians have every right to remove all occupying forces from their land. That's the compromise. There can't be a two-state solution. They're not two states. It's Palestine, and it's an occupying force it's a foreign occupying force aided by Western imperialism. It's not there can't be a compromise that doesn't allow Palestinians to return, because there's hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who are living in in camps in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, who can't return to their land, and they're constantly being kicked out. So there is no compromise other than the Palestinians getting their land back and the occupying forces completely leaving the country. So but what would you say to? What would you say?
I mean, I agree with all that, especially because I think in the film it goes over a bunch of the legal maneuvering that went on. You have early on in the film, it talks about Zionists buying land from the absentee landlords. That was in that was in like the early beginnings of Zionist project, was trying to buy land from the absentee landlords. But by 1947, they still only owned 5% of land. But then guess what happened? They went to the United Nations. United Nations said, let's slice up the land and give the majority of it, 52% of it, to the Zionists. So it's like, let's imagine a situation where there's a two-state agreement. Is that going to be a fair agreement? Is that going to be an agreement that gives an accurate portion of the land? Who are going to be the leaders of these two states? I wouldn't, if I was a Palestinian, I would not trust the Israeli settlers. Just like the indigenous here in the U.S. don't trust the United States government. Just like Africans in the U.S. don't trust the United States government, because legal structures and all that, it's based on power. It's based on who can oppress another group from who can enforce the legal structures. So I wouldn't trust any Israeli settlers, and I would say no. There's no compromise. It's land back. It's it's building a state that's powerful enough to enforce Palestine. What the masses want.
Exactly. And then like in all of these cases, basically we say the same things. So like, in South Africa, they're like, it's a black state. It's, if you're willing to live under the rule of a black majority of the black majority of the African majority, well, then you can stay. If you follow the rules and you're willing to contribute to the construction of Azania, then you can stay, no matter if you're white, black, whatever the fuck.
Right.
But that's the problem when we get to where you have a state that's already set up to be, a racist state set up on top of another one, and you annex land and stuff like that. And then you want to ask for a compromise. You know what I mean? Like if you're willing to accept the rule of the Palestinian majority, well then okay, then you can be under one Palestinian state, but there is no two-state solution where you get to keep all your weapons, you get to keep your aid, you get to keep, certain portions of land without actually, capitulating to anything. Like you said, I wouldn't trust them. We saw in the film where the girl's talking about how, how they constructed the places and the city centers, and how Bethlehem is close to, the city center in Jerusalem, but it's not considered part of Jerusalem because the majority of the population is Palestinian. So things like that. It's just
Right.
they won't even be able to tell you how a two-state solution will work outside of Israel, like the so-called peace activists said, outside of Israel maintaining Israel as it wants to be. So
Right, and that makes me also bring up is I think it's kind of liberal thinking to imagine a two-state solution, especially when you ask the question, what do Israelis want? And I think the Israeli settlers want to continue their ethnic cleansing and to kill all the Palestinians. I don't think there's any mass consciousness that's like, you know what, we've been wrong. We want to do right. And it's like, no. If you've ever been on on Twitter and watched a lot of the Palestinian Twitter accounts post videos, you see all the time non-armed forces settlers, Israeli settlers that terrorize Palestinians. It's not like an uncommon thing. Israeli settler children terrorize other Palestinians. So it's like what is realistic about a solution to this? And the solution is not like a fun one. In terms of Israelis, let's say in a situation where Israelis are under Palestine has become its own state, has enough power and authority to all that. How would Israelis live under that if they don't go back to Europe or something? I always wonder. In my mind, I think we should look to the lessons of Mao's Cultural Revolution, because he was dealing with situations where you and at Mao's time of having you had to deal with all these conflicting classes, especially exploiting classes, and you had to re-socialize them in various ways. You had to build communes, and you had to do all kinds of re-socializing different classes of people. So I can imagine there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Mao's Cultural Revolution in terms of the structures to change social consciousness, because it's not like you have a Palestinian state and all Israelis love it all the time. No, that's an internal enemy. How are you going to deal with an internal enemy now that they're the Israelis, So
exactly. And so they don't ever have answers for how its two-state solution would work, because it can't work, and they know it. But that's the way they keep things even kill. Well, we're trying to be used. That's a compromise. You know what I mean? So that's for them, it's a compromise. And so it's easy to keep people at bay when you're literally faking compromises and stuff like that, and people will just they'll take it and they'll digest it and they'll and they'll go along with their day. And they're like, oh my God, Israel is actually trying to be benevolent. And they, these Palestinians, they just don't want to actually get with the program. Why not? That's two-state solution. That's better than it. It's ridiculous how these things come to be. But like you said about Mao and the Cultural Revolution, I wish, I just wish always that the context of this could be, we could always discuss it with, in the context of capitalism and imperialism, when the discussions happen in mass, what I mean? Like that, because it can't be divorced from that. So how can a two-state solution or any kind of supposed compromise work without actually, and, like you said, learning lessons from Mao, the reason they were able to, wage a cultural revolution and stuff like that was actually effective was because they were radically changing the way society was structured around the socio-political and economic system that they were existing in at the time. So if you're not actually changing the fundamental values of the whole entire place, whether you want it to be an Israeli state with Palestinians living under it, or a two-state solution, or Palestine takes over their land and there's Israelis living there. If you don't radically transform the way people relate to their socio-political and economic system that they live under, then it's going to be ineffective. And that's why Mao and we already know Cuba and stuff like that. That's why they're such beacons, and they're so there's so much to gain from them in whatever context. We know that we want to be context specific, but in so many just various contexts, we can look to them for for guidance, because they, they
Yeah.
actually did something that was effective, and it meant something, and yeah.
Absolutely. I also think it's, and I'm sure the Palestinians, especially all the organizations, have already, done this for years and years and years. But I think looking at some of the limitations, I wouldn't say outright failures, but limitations of the national liberation struggles in Africa are highly educational of what happens when you have national liberation struggles which don't imagine themselves as building towards communism, because they underestimate class struggle and how that operates not only within the place that they're living, but also like within the party, within the organizations themselves. There's always class struggle, right? So we can imagine a situation where Palestinians, or like Rashad said, any configuration that you can imagine, we don't want to just reinvent old exploitation. The point isn't to get, I don't imagine the point is for Palestinians to live under really shitty capitalism. Obviously, they need to develop productive forces and all that, because they're literally living in an open air prison. So obviously, there needs to be development of industry and all that. But we all know that the transition. Socialism, how most people understand it, is supposed to be a transition, developing industry and productive forces in such a way you can build towards communism. But communism is dealing with, you have to deal with class struggle, because you have to, deal with class contradictions, class antagonisms. So I think it's always important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. I was just seeing in the chat, someone named Jay said, I find it helpful to think of Europe not as clearly delineated place on the map, peninsular of the big island, but Europe as an epoch of white imperialism that started as a Vitruvian idea in the 14th century. Israel is a part of the Europacene. I like that. Because that, like we were talking about earlier, all these things are they all steal from each other because they're connected, and they've recognized that connection, early on into the project of settler colonialism, early on into the project of, of the development of capitalism. They began to figure out, okay, well, whiteness actually might be more beneficial to bond ourselves together. Our Europeanness, our European heritage, wherever the fuck it comes from, we might, differ on where it comes from, and, have national pride, and but at the same time, it's Europe and stuff like that. And, especially the ruling class, like they specifically the ruling class of Europe, they got a hold of that really early, and they began to just, extend it, and then other things pop up, and then, that's how you get, Israel on the scene and stuff like that. It's.
Yeah. I think what the person in the comments is hinting at too is like the kind of I guess for me, I like to see it as you could think of it as like I always like to base things in class analysis. So that's like where I start, because I think it's useful because you want a materialist analysis, just meaning we look at what are the interests of the different classes that are actors in political conflicts. And then on top of that, these different groups of people, these classes, build out ideological justification and ideological motivations. So this can be things like we saw early in like the 15th century and all that around there. A lot of the justification and ideology around then was religious, very, very much so religious. It wasn't it was religious, and of course always national to an extent. And then we see jump forward in time with colonial expansion. You get this this idea of whiteness, right? So it becomes this ideology of racism, of civilizing the savages and so on. So I don't. Ideas have their place, but I think we always start with what are people trying to do. So
Exactly. And that's where, to me, like the message gets lost, and I feel like it's rough for what the Palestinians have been going through for, you know, over 100 years, because the truth is, it's there. You know what I mean? It's right there. And I get the propaganda, and I get the, you know, the media and stuff like that. I get it. I do get it. And how, you know, that's a force that is hard to overcome, most definitely. But the facts are the facts. And so, like, you know, it always gets overturned, and it always gets misconstrued, because the ruling class has the power, and they have all the institutions set up to benefit their project that they've been developing for you know, the better part of 500 years and stuff like that. So it's just it's rough what they got to go through, man. And like, I feel for them so much, and that they've gone through so many different phases of struggle, you know, within 100 years. It's like really impressive. Like it's truly impressive. And I really get like a lot of inspiration from the Palestinian struggle, because they just keep coming, and they like don't stop. And I just get the feeling when I hear members of their organization, when I hear family members who talk after the death of the loved ones, they, like, you know, they got it. You know, they understand the struggle, and they understand that it can't stop until they're free. And that's like, you know, there's some powerful shit that's, you know, they're put down the air, and that's what can't die. You know what I mean? That's what's always going to live on, is that fight and stuff like that. And that shit's inspiring to me.
Absolutely. I think the energy you get for self-determination is huge. That's why I think we should never forget of where we come from, the land that we're on, and who we're fighting for and who we're fighting against, you know?
Yep. And so, yeah, Nwadi Obi said, yeah, as Horn points out, British colonization needed all these warm bodies to surpass Spanish colonization in the 15th to 17th century. Yeah, Gerald Horne's book, the Dawning of the Apocalypse, the whole Apocalypse series. But yeah, he details that so well. And, you know, we always want to shout out to Dr. Horn, and, you know, some of the we'll just leave that. We always want to shout out Dr. Horn and the work, the amazing and useful work that he does, because it you know, that it helps us in current times. So we, you know, like we're talking about with the British and the Spanish colonization, we understand that laid the blueprint for Israel to come about and say, hey, well, even if we wanted to criticize them, what would they would turn to the age-old thing. Well, why won't you guys say anything about yourselves? Or why can't we, you know, you guys did it, America did it, France did it, and such and such and such and such. And like that, you know, so Dr. Horn's work does a lot for us, because he laid it out perfectly how they transition from religion and nationality to whiteness, and how that benefited them, and how they still the whole time, well, even while they were developing the whiteness project, how they were still able to keep on to the religious aspects of the religious and the national aspects of that, you know, of the fight that they wanted to wage against us. They were able to keep those as tools, as weapons, while developing their ultimate weapon, which was the unity of whiteness, or being European.
Yeah, I think Dr. Horn is incredibly useful. Dawning Apocalypse, 1776. His newer book, that's I think it's like 1836. It's one on American fascism. All those are great because they deal with settler colonialism, you know, and that deals with the development of capitalism. That's you know, colonial expansion is you know, that primitive accumulation, if you will, of capitalism. That's how, you know, you have to have land. You know, similar. The Gerald Horn is useful. Also, like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, because she has the indigenous peoples. Indigenous People's History of United States. I'm probably butchering the title. I think
that's it.
Okay, yeah, that one. You know, it's important to look at that because what we consider, you know, whiteness is a social construction, but that's not to be used as a buzzword. It is something that was constructed through some kind of social process, and it's very important to actually historically look at that, because what is the construction of of Zionism, of like Israeli this Israeli identity and position? You know, it's a social process, a very genocidal one. Yeah,
And that, you know, that's like the principal part of like how we, to me, and also what Dr. Horn talks about in his interviews and also in some of his books. But that's like, you know, I feel like we have to mention that's like, that's the foundation of what it's going to take for this struggle to become internationalized and stuff like that, because we have to recognize, and we have before, but it has to be at a larger level where we have to recognize that all these settler colonial projects resemble each other because they take from each other, and they're the same. It's the same project, just done in different contexts and different times with different groups of people. But it's the same. They have the same foundation of needing land. So you exterminate the indigenous population in whatever way you can, whether it be through disease, through war and genocide, through obviously killing off women and children and the elderly. So they have the same
using legal bullshit.
Legal bullshit, yeah, exactly. Because then you come in and you have to reinforce the violence with the paper and stuff like that. Reinforce the gun with the pen, and so you supposedly legitimize the war you just waged against the indigenous populations of these places. And so the stuff that's going on here in America, we see it, and we see some of that stuff in Palestine. So like, obviously gentrification is different, but that's it resembles what is happening to the Palestinians and how they have these open air prisons and how they have how they're being pushed out of areas and separated from city centers due to, or separated from certain zones because of the population that's there and what resources they get and stuff like that. So it's like this, and so you get the same thing in South Africa. You get the same thing you did get the same thing in Zimbabwe. Rhodesia, thank you guys for correcting me on that, because Rhodesia was Zimbabwe, not South Africa. But yeah, so like all these things, and so like that would help so much for us to internationalize that struggle for, those of us here in the Snakes, especially Africans, but also indigenous people, to recognize, oh shit, the same things are going on. We're waging the same struggle. How can we link these things together so that, we're able to fight, within our own context here, but also be able to, network and come together and make our struggle broader and louder and bigger and more ferocious and omnipresent. So yeah. Yeah. So Nwadi said, yeah, it's like a network of prisons and reservations. Exactly. That's it.
I think today, especially, we should. I think a lot of us are, but we should be especially worried seeing things like Cop City in Atlanta right now. They're preparing for like urban warfare. So that's it reminds me of like of just Israelis get practice terrorizing in a very coordinated way all the time. It seems like our armed thugs of the state want to get the same kind of practice.
And that's why we get NYPD offices in Tel Aviv.
Oh yeah, that's a great point.
And so like but it's so crazy. Like we're fighting this, it's the same, it's similar things, just with different tactics. So yeah, Cop City, they're doing it's a $90 million budget to learn how to murder Black people, more poor Black people, poor Africans, poor people in general,
racialized and colonized people.
Exactly. Just to murder them more efficiently and and to test out weapons, because they're using that, the 1033 program to upgrade these troops on the ground, these officers with military style weapons to use against, more often than not, unarmed civilians and stuff like that. So, it's just, it's
I mean, like here in Albuquerque, the SWAT team, the Albuquerque Police Department is a murderous gang. They literally burned alive an African child last year during a SWAT team. And I bring up the SWAT team because most SWAT teams in cities have this like $1 million budget of various arms. Like they will have literally like rocket launchers, drones, all that. But they don't get to train on that all the time. They need like a large places to actually do crazy training. So what is Cop City but to train how to terrorize more of us via a SWAT team, via normal patrolmen and what have you. So
yep. And so like I think they have one also in Detroit. They have like a similar Cop City, or in Michigan. I don't know if it's in Detroit, but I'm pretty sure it's in Michigan. They have a similar thing that they developed already that's similar to what's trying to be developed in Atlanta. With Cop City, where also it's like the degradation of land for this too. So not only do you get to just practice fucking murdering people, you also get to destroy land that isn't yours. And so like
it's also very important for us, like just for like what they say, like to protect from floods and I think to keep the heat down also, of course, all that. And it's like they don't care. They would
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And so, like they have all these multitude of ways of going about oppressing people and keeping people subdued and waging war on them without these populations, essentially waging war back, unless you're the Palestinians. And then when they do, well, they have tactics for that too. So, and that's, they're preparing for that. We had the BLA wars here and stuff like that, where the Black Lives Army, where the Black Liberation Army,
they ain't doing that.
Sorry. But yeah, the Black Liberation Army, so they have tactics for that too when they decide to fight back. But other than that, they can't do anything. Outside of that, they don't have any other recourse other than to take land and to do all these things to be able to be more effective at their job. And so it's just it's unfortunate, and all the death that's already happened. The death that's happened already. They're already killed the protester. They're already well equipped to do it anyway. So like the justification for it is just we needed to be more efficient. It's crazy.
Yep.
Is there anything else you want to mention? Anyone in the chat want to mention anything or give quick thoughts on what you thought about the film? Yeah, just put in the chat. But also, yeah, Obi said again that the amount of chemical weapons used against protesters in the U.S. Yeah, the chemical weapons. I went to one of the protests out here in Denver, and a couple of the protests. I worked a lot, so But either way, they were shooting the paintball ones that like explode, and they have some type of like gas in them, and that shit stays with you for so fucking long, and they hurt. Like their paintballs are like they're like little balls of paint, and they hit you and they hurt, and when they explode, they fucking turn into like tear gas and shit like that. It's fucking the weapons that I've never seen that before. Like I've been to protests where they did the tear gas thing, the normal ones, or like the big guns that they spray, and it's a bunch of mace, and they have like long range mace guns. But I've never seen them paintball exploding tear gas. It was crazy.
I remember during the like George Floyd uprising, there's a lot of people getting like hit in the eye with those canisters. Like they're like blinding people literally. That's crazy.
Yeah, and they all these things are well to do, are okay within the settler colonial, within the the hyper policed, the military industrial nature of these nations, because we see Israel doing the same things. They're they're responding to people throwing rocks and stuff like, and that's something that they actually bring up legitimately. They'll bring up children in Palestine throwing rocks at tanks as like justification for some type of supposed retaliation and stuff like that. That goes obviously extreme and above and beyond like what should be acceptable. And so you got kids throwing Molotov cocktails at at tanks or at walls and stuff that the IDF is hiding behind, and they get to use that as justification for murder. And it's just ridiculous. Like it's not even these things. We're not fighting on the same terms, but they try to make it seem like it is all like throughout the entire time of these conflicts going on. So yeah.
I mean, it's just like the police here in the U.S., right? I mean, like they see someone move in a way they don't like, they see someone respond in a tone they don't like, and they take that as like a threat to their lives because they don't see reality from our position. They're trained, like here in the U.S., they're trained as everyone out there is their enemy. They're not here to protect. They're here to like eliminate and shut down. And that's just like that's an ideology that they're trained into. They anything is a justification to shoot you. I remember on a couple of days ago I saw a Twitter video. I think it was Seattle Police Department, where there's police like up towards a hill who are shining light, a really bright light down on an African on one side of the sidewalk, and there's a couple people around, and the police had their weapons drawn and said, "Put the gun down," and like they're screaming at them and everything. And the African doesn't have a gun anywhere. There's people around him all with phones on that are recording and shouting to the police, "No one here has a gun but you." Like but they're like convinced that the person has a gun. This is like they're like two different sets of realities. Like, and they would have shot and killed that African if it wasn't for somebody stepping in front and all the community coming together and saying, "There's no one here has a gun."
Yep, exactly. And so like stuff like that is like, excuse me, I'm sorry. Stuff like that is like going on all around the world. So like, Obi said again in the chat that, Israel trains African police forces as well. Mm-hmm. And so, all that collaboration, it actually does have an effect and stuff like that. They were actually collaborating on how to better police and murder and occupy colonized people's land and in their communities. And so like all these things, they're in contact with each other. They're in various strategic places with each other where they get to, share information. They have, they're probably using some of the same exact systems and shit like that. You know what I mean? Like computer systems that share information. So like it does have an actual effect. They're not just doing it because it's fashionable or like because they want to like use some of their fucking clothes or some shit. No, like they actually have a direct purpose of doing these things because they have to, because we are, although obviously here we're not at the point of armed resistance, they know that it happened before and that these things people don't forget. When you learn something, you don't forget. We never lost that idea of that being a possibility, of armed resistance being a path. We might have deviated from it and we might not be, practicing that at this very moment in time, but that's not something that we've lost. And so they do have a actual, it's reactionary, but they do have a reason to be convening together because they know that when we band together, which we will, it's going to spell trouble for them and they're going to have to be ready. They're going to have to be more ready than they were before. And so it's not by accident. It's not like just to do it. They're like, they actually have gains from it and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, whenever you have a strong movement that's organized and led by strong organizations who are militant and revolutionary, that's when the question of armed struggle comes into play. And obviously, there's a bunch of legal structures, there's a bunch of policing, ideological weapons that are used to demobilize and depoliticize people, so they're not even at the preliminary stage of movement building. So, I mean, you know, I think a lot of times the states internationally have a longer, perhaps, memory, or they're just more, strategical, I guess, than we like to think. But yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, most definitely, most definitely. And so we'll wrap up in a few, basically in a few. But I just, thank you guys. I enjoyed I don't know if enjoyed is like actually the right word. I used that earlier, but I don't know if it was informative because, you get the long history of how Zionism developed, and, obviously I would rather hear something from the Palestinian side. And, there's documentaries and there's films that have been made, most definitely.
If folks have recommendations, drop it in the comments.
Yeah, one that Dev Springer and was promoting. Was talking about Black Power Media, and he wanted us to go watch it. I actually watched it, and I can't remember what it was called. Maybe one of you guys in the chat will remember, but it was really, yeah, it was really it was a good film, and I I appreciate stuff like that. And yeah, like Obi said, you do learn a lot from it, but they're, the contradictions, you hear them and stuff like that. And I'm glad that we hear them and we're able to point them out about, about the questioning the tactics of resistance, questioning Palestinians' tactics of resistance, when we know that that they have the right to use any means of resistance that they see fit. So yeah, you learn a lot, even though there's contradictions that exist within it and stuff like that. But yeah, also, I just want to say, also, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And we want to also just, shout out to the Lions of Jenin, the Lions of Jericho, the Lions of Nablus, the Lions of Bethlehem, because, they're Farha. Thank you, KD, for that movie. The movie was Farha. I think it's still on Netflix. It's a good film, and it was being protested by Israeli Zionists and stuff like that. But it was a real good film, and it actually was pretty tame. Like, it was a pretty tame movie. So all the criticisms and all the things about, why are they showing this and yada yada, it's just crazy. It was pretty. There was like a couple scenes in it that were pretty rough.
Settlers lost their goddamn mind.
Exactly. How dare these people make their own film about their own history? Crazy. But yeah, we just want to shout out to the Lions of Palestine, because they're doing the damn thing out there, and they're not going to stop, and they will win. And I hope we're around to see the victory, and be able to celebrate in solidarity with them when they do win. So yeah, Salifu got him chat. Shout out to Salifu and KD. Peace to you. But yeah, Zach, did you have anything else that you wanted to say before we close out?
Struggle for Palestine is our struggle. Internationalized struggle. Obviously, build resistance where you are and organize. Do all that. Solidarity should mean that you're doing something material, not just talking about it. So if you can contribute. That's what I say.
Yep, most definitely. And so yeah, we want to lastly just say thank you for joining us. We will be back next month with the Pan-African Film Series, and I'm pretty sure we'll be having a weekly Pan-African news this month, which will be back from a hiatus as well. So also, support BAT. They're always taking donations. Support obviously the AAPRP. We are always accepting donations and funds so that we can fund movement work and stuff like that. Community movement builders, people's programs. There's Palestinian organizations you can definitely support. I wish I had them on hand. I apologize for that. But there's definitely ones that you can find, and that, you know, that goes directly to students in Palestine who need help with education.
There's often a youth student organizations on various campuses. Like there's also BDS, you know, different things like that. So.
Exactly. Well, there's a lot of things we can do to support our comrades in Palestine, our people in Palestine, and so we always want to keep them in our minds and in our movement work. And so, yeah, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and free them all. And yeah, forward ever. Thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you guys soon. Appreciate it. Peace.
Unless we talking headless. Shit. Super